There's a silent killer that has infiltrated dinner tables, grocery stores and farms without anyone noticing. It has no smell, no taste, and no warning signs. And once it's inside you, there is no getting it out. I'm talking about radiation in food.
We all think of nuclear disasters as massive explosions, deadly radiation zones, and evacuations. But what about the food? What happens when contamination isn't just in the air, but in the very things we eat?
When a nuclear disaster happens, clouds of radioactive particles are released into the air. These particles don't just stay at the disaster site, they travel. They fall onto farms, seep into rivers, and contaminate entire food chains. Plants absorb radiation straight from the soil. Livestock eat contaminated grass. Fish swim in radioactive waters. Meat that could kill you in the long run. The worst culprits: cesium-137 and iodine-131. Iodine-131 is a silent killer. It targets the thyroid, increasing the risk of cancer, especially in children. It spreads through milk, leafy greens, and anything that absorbs radiation fast. Cesium-137 is even worse. It mimics potassium, meaning your body absorbs it without hesitation. It gets trapped in muscles and organs, where it lingers for decades, increasing cancer risk over time. Governments scramble to contain the damage, but history has shown they don't always act fast enough. People have unknowingly eaten radioactive meals, some without ever being warned. And the real question is, could traces of these disasters still be in our food today?
You might think radiation poisoning only happens in moves or disaster zones, but the truth is far scarier. Some of the worst nuclear accidents in history didn't just poison the air, they poisoned the food supply. And today, we are exposing 5 of the most terrifying nuclear disasters that contaminated what people ate. By the end of this, might never look at your food the same way again.
You are watching Bizarre Nutrition. Hit subscribe, smash that like, and tap the bell if you are ready to go where most people won't. Accident number 5. The Windscale fire, the worst nuclear accident in the UK's history. October 10th, 1957, Cumbria, England. Inside a nuclear facility called Windscale, a reactor catches fire. But this isn't just smoke and ash. This is radioactive hell. A silent horror spreads across the English countryside. You can see it, you can smell it, but it's in the air, in the soil, in the very food people eat. This wasn't just a disaster, it was a slow, creeping death, leaking from the Windscale nuclear reactor. At first, the government assured everyone there was no immediate danger, but they lied. The truth? The milk supply across Britain was so toxic with radiation that it had to be destroyed for months. And worse, many had already consumed it. What went wrong? Why did scientists gamble with a reactor they knew was unstable? And how close did Britain come to an even deadlier catastrophe?
Windscale wasn't just fire. It was one of the biggest nuclear cover-ups in history, and it nearly wiped the entire region off the map.
It all started after World War II, when the world was racing to build nuclear weapons. Britain wanted its own atomic bomb, and Windscale was their answer. 2 massive reactors, called piles, were built to produce plutonium, one of the deadliest substances known to man. But there was a problem. These reactors weren't designed with safety in mind. Cooling them was a nightmare. Scientists warned that something could go horribly wrong. But the pressure was on. Britain's leaders wanted results, and so they ignored the warnings. What happened next was a disaster waiting to happen. Deep inside the Windscale reactor, something was wrong. The uranium rods, stacked like a glowing skeleton inside the massive core, were supposed to heat and cool in a controlled cycle. But this time, the temperature kept climbing. Scientists panicked. They had one solution, a process called annealing, where they cranked up the heat even higher, hoping to burn off the trapped energy safely. It was a gamble, and it failed. Deep within the reactor, a fire had ignited, but no one knew. Not yet.
Picture this, a nuclear fire burning out of control inside a reactor with no proper containment. No alarms, no radiation shields, just pure chaos. And the worst part, it kept burning for 2 days before anyone even realized it.
By the time scientists understood what was happening, it was too late. The fire had spread through the core, burning radioactive materials at temperatures hotter than molten steel. Radiation poured into the air, carried by the wind across England. And then came the real nightmare, the milk. Radiation doesn't just disappear, it lingers, it settles, and in this case, it found its way into the grass. British cows, thousands of them, grazed on contaminated fields, their milk absorbing the invisible poison. Then, that milk was bottled, distributed, and delivered straight to the homes of millions of people. For weeks, nobody knew. Families drank radioactive milk daily, oblivious to the slow poison slipping into their bodies.
The government had one option: destroy every drop of milk before it could do more damage. The final count: 2 million liters of milk poured straight into the ground. And yet, it wasn't enough. The damage already done.
Doctors began noticing a rise in cancer cases. Thyroid cancers, leukemia, illnesses linked to radiation exposure started creeping into statistics. The government? Silent. They wouldn't admit the full scope of the disaster for decades. Windscale was a nuclear accident that should have been as infamous as Chernobyl, but instead, it is little known in history. Accident number 4. The 3 Mile Island accident, the most serious nuclear incident in US commercial power plant history. March 28, 1979. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The city wakes up to something it can't see, but might be breathing in. Inside the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant, a mechanical valve sticks open. A pump fails. Then, operators misread the situation. The cooling system failed. The core began to overheat. For 2 hours, the temperature climbed relentlessly, reaching 4,300 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously close to the point where everything could have been wiped out. But what's even more terrifying is that radiation was leaking, invisibly, quietly, seeping into the environment. No one knew. No sirens, no explosions, just a quiet release of iodine-131. Radiation doesn't arrive like a storm. It rides the breeze, it settles on rooftops, it lands in open fields, and in Pennsylvania, those fields were full of cows and crops.
Suddenly, government agents start scrambling. What if the grass is contaminated? What if the milk is toxic? How fast can iodine-131 move through the food chain?
Here's what they knew. Radioactive iodine mimics regular iodine. It's absorbed by the thyroid gland like a magnet, and it's often delivered in the most unassuming vessel imaginable, a glass of milk. Milk was the first target, not because it was the most radioactive, but because it was the most fragile. Cows don't wait, they graze, they produce, and if radioactive iodine lands on that grass, it enters the milk almost instantly. FDA teams rushed in to test local supplies. What they found was unsettling. Traces of iodine-131 in milk, low but not invisible, safe but not comforting. Spinach, lettuce, root vegetables, everything became suspect. What else had radiation touched?
3 Mile Island didn't just leak radioactive gas, it leaked out to homes, into headlines, and especially into what people fed their kids.
No mass food recalls were issued. no large-scale poisonings occurred, but the real damage? Psychological. Even after the FDA cleared food products, people tossed out entire fridges. Farmers watched milk rot in barrels. Some parents refused to cook vegetables for weeks, avoiding anything grown locally. The fear of invisible contamination spread faster than the radiation itself. Why? Because once the idea of invisible poison enters your head, it's hard to eat without second-guessing every bite. And that fear had a consequence. Public trust in nuclear safety crumbled overnight. 3 Mile Island became the cautionary tale, a blueprint. It didn't just change nuclear regulation, it forced America to rethink how it handles food safety when radiation is even remotely involved. And it set the stage for disasters far, far worse.
It wasn't the last mistake, it wasn't the worst one, but it was a warning. Because the next disaster didn't just shake confidence. It poisoned food, it silenced villages, and it vanished from history books for decades.
Accident number 3. The Kyshtym disaster, the second worst nuclear accident in the Soviet Union's history. September 29th, 1957. Deep in the Soviet Union, a facility called Mayak. Imagine waking up one morning to find your entire town erased from history. Not destroyed by war, not abandoned by choice, but wiped clean, as if it never existed. No records, no explanations, just gone. Sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? But this isn't fiction. This happened. And not because of an invasion or a natural disaster, but because of one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. And what was released into the environment? 20 million curies of radioactive waste. To put that in perspective, that's twice the radiation released at Hiroshima. But this wasn't just an environmental nightmare. It was a nutritional one. An explosion so catastrophic that it turned entire villages into radioactive wastelands, poisoned thousands, and permanently altered the land, water, and food supply. And yet, almost no one knows about it. Why? Because the Soviet Union made sure the world never found out. And the people who suffered, they were left to die, silently, unknowingly, and worst of all, invisibly. For decades, the Soviet government buried the evidence, silenced the victims, and denied the disaster ever happened. While the world remembers Chernobyl, the Kyshtym disaster was the catastrophe that came first. A horrifying prelude to nuclear devastation, ignored until it was too late.
So what really happened that day? How did it stay hidden? How many people suffered without ever knowing why? The truth is darker than you can imagine.
Deep in the Ural Mountains, inside the heavily guarded Mayak Production Association, a top-secret Soviet nuclear facility, something went terribly wrong. A tank containing highly radioactive waste exploded with the force of at least 70 tons of TNT. The blast was so powerful that it sent a deadly cloud of radioactive dust across hundreds of kilometers, contaminating everything in its path. The explosion's wake, a radioactive plume stretched across 23,000 square kilometers, forming what's now called the East Urals radioactive trace. Villages were dusted with fallout, crops were showered in radioactive particles, and the Teka River, a lifeline for hundreds of communities, became a flowing stream of poison. Here's the part that will make your blood run cold. Nobody told the people living nearby what had happened. For days, they continued their lives as usual, eating, drinking, breathing in the invisible death that surrounded them. More than 270,000 people were exposed to extreme levels of radiation. But the Soviet authorities, they stayed silent. It took an entire week before they started evacuations. And even then, they gave no explanations. People were forced to leave their homes with no idea why. But here's the real horror. Some villages were never evacuated at all. Their residents were left to die, slowly, painfully, as radiation seeped into their bones.
Now, let's talk about something even more disturbing: the food.
The contamination hit grain storage facilities first. Silos were exposed, allowing radioactive ash to settle directly onto food staples like wheat and rye. Bread, Russia's most sacred food, was suddenly a carrier of strontium-90, an isotope known to embed itself in human bone. Milk became another radioactive bombshell. Cows grazed on fallout-covered grass. More than 80% of radioactive activity in milk was traced to strontium-90 and its decay products. The result? A terrifying increase in cancers, leukemia, and immune system failure.
So what did the Soviet government do? Did they warn the people, offer medical help, evacuate everyone at risk? No, they covered it up.
For decades, the Soviet Union refused to acknowledge the disaster. Medical records were altered or destroyed. Survivors who spoke out, they were silenced. It wasn't until 1976, almost 20 years later, that the world learned what had happened. And even then, it was through a Soviet scientist who risked everything to leak the truth. The Kyshtym disaster was one of the deadliest nuclear catastrophes in history, but almost no one knows about it. It was a warning that went ignored. And decades later, history repeated itself in Chernobyl.
The question is, what else don't we know? How many other disasters have been buried? And if history keeps repeating itself, what happens next? And if you thought it was the worst of it, wait until we cross the Pacific. Because Japan's nightmare didn't come from war, it came from water.
Accident number 2. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, the most severe nuclear accident since Chernobyl, March 11, 2011. At 2:46 p.m., the Earth beneath northeastern Japan violently shifts. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake, one of the strongest ever recorded, tears through the seabed. But it's not the quake that delivers the death blow. It's what comes next. A tsunami. A wall of water over 14 meters high slams into the coast. Entire towns are obliterated in a second. Cars, houses, even ships dragged inland like toys. Over 15,000 lives are lost. But inside the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, a silent countdown begins. Floodwaters breach seawalls, backup generators fail, control rooms go dark, and within hours, 3 nuclear reactors begin to melt down.
Radiation is released into the air, but the most dangerous leak, it flows directly into the sea.
Cesium-137, iodine-131, strontium-90. Names you've heard before, but this time they're flowing into coastal waters, spreading like invisible ink across the Pacific. Fishermen are ordered to stop. Seafood is tested. Entire industries collapse overnight.
Japan, a nation that built its culinary identity on the purity of the sea, now faces a terrifying question. Is the ocean feeding us or poisoning us?
Here's what scientists discovered. Within 4 days of the disaster, radioactive isotopes were detected in milk, spinach, and drinking water across multiple prefectures. But that was just the surface. Mushrooms, wild vegetables, tea leaves, and seafood, especially bottom feeders and large predator fish, began showing elevated levels of cesium-137, which bioaccumulates in animal tissue. Even more alarming, contaminated fish were detected hundreds of kilometers away. The isotopes were riding currents, slipping through ecosystems, and showing up in places far beyond Japan's borders.
People weren't just afraid to swim, they were afraid to eat. Sushi shops emptied, grocers pulled products off shelves, and fishermen never went back to sea.
Within a week, Japan imposed emergency limits on radiation in food and beverages. Entire regions were blacklisted from selling produce. Rigorous testing began. Over 800,000 food samples analyzed in the following years. And while most foods passed, a few didn't. Beef, mushrooms, wild boar, and freshwater fish often exceeded safety thresholds, especially in regions where cesium had sunk deep into forest floors and riverbeds. Some areas remained off-limits for farming and fishing for years. And even with intense regulation, one chilling fact remained. Radiation doesn't expire overnight. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years. The contamination wasn't gone. It just spread out. Food scarcity became a hidden crisis. With damaged supply chains and destroyed infrastructure, evacuated families relied on emergency rations, canned goods, instant noodles, salty snacks. Malnutrition followed, vitamin deficiency surged, sodium levels skyrocketed. A 2014 study tracked over 30,000 people in Fukushima. Only a few showed dangerous internal cesium levels. But psychologically, the fear of food contamination lingered for years. Some families refused to eat locally grown food, even when tests showed it was clean.
Why? Because once the idea of poisoned food enters the culture, it doesn't live quietly. This wasn't just about radioactive food, it was about the collapse of nutritional access in an already traumatized population.
Fukushima changed how we see seafood. It changed how we think about water, and it exposed a chilling truth. The fallout from a nuclear disaster doesn't stop at borders. In the years since, radioactive water continues to be stored, debated, and slowly released legally into the Pacific. Governments say it's safe, but trust? That's much harder to restore than an ocean. Accident number 1. The Chernobyl disaster, the worst nuclear accident in human history. April 26, 1986, Pripyat, Ukraine. During a botched safety test at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, reactor 4 explodes. Not overheats, explodes. The blast blows a 1,000-ton concrete lid into the air. Fires ignite, radioactive graphite burns. A plume of iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and other lethal isotopes is launched into the atmosphere, invisible, unstoppable, and global. Within 36 hours, the nearby city of Pripyat is evacuated, but the radiation, it's already moving. Wind carries the radioactive cloud over Belarus, Russia, Poland, Germany, Austria, even reaching the UK and Scandinavia. And then it rains. This wasn't water. This was radioactive rainfall, turning entire regions into toxic zones. The fallout sinks into the soil. It coats pastures, rivers, gardens, and soon it enters the food chain. In Ukraine and Belarus, milk becomes dangerously radioactive. In Sweden and Finland, wild game like reindeer and moose are found with off-the-charts levels of cesium-137. In Germany, Greece, and Italy, fresh vegetables show contamination. Even sheep farming faces restrictions for several years in parts of Wales, England, and Scotland. No one was safe, not even people thousands of kilometers away. Chernobyl didn't just poison the air, it poisoned the ordinary. Milk, bread, berries, mushrooms, food so familiar, so human, suddenly carried radiation capable of altering your cells. In the red forest outside Chernobyl, pine trees turned a copper color within hours. Dead, radiated, forever changed. Soil samples showed cesium-137 deposits exceeding 100,000 becquerels per square meter, a level so dangerous it rendered entire farmlands unusable for generations. Mushrooms, known for absorbing minerals from the earth, became radioactive sponges. So did berries. So did wild boars, who remain contaminated to this day, nearly 40 years later. Livestock was culled, crops were burned, rivers were quarantined, and still people ate, because they had no choice. Iodine-131 entered milk. Thyroid cancer cases surged across Belarus and Ukraine, particularly in those exposed during childhood. Cesium-137 settled in muscles, strontium-90 nested in bones. The result? An explosion of immune system disorders, cancers, and birth defects in contaminated regions. And then came the cleanup crews, over 600,000 liquidators. Many were exposed to lethal doses, some ate contaminated food, others drank radioactive water while fighting fires. Even the people trying to save the world were poisoned by it. To this day, areas near Chernobyl remain restricted, and yet some locals, called returnees, chose to come back. They grow crops in radioactive soil. They hunt game tainted with cesium. They say, "We'd rather die on our land than live as exiles." But scientists who visit the zone wear full protection suits. The food might look normal, it might taste fine, but its half-life is still ticking.
Chernobyl showed us the final horrifying truth. Radioactive contamination doesn't just kill instantly. It hides in the veins of an apple, in the grains of a bread, in the cells of a child. And sometimes we invite it in with a fork.